III. Joining me now to discuss this is royal broadcaster and commentator Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Hey Rafe, how are you doing? Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry you couldn't make it in person. I know there is a nightmare in Paddington right now, but I'm glad you could join us down the line. Can you start us off by giving us a brief synopsis of what the divine right of kings means in our context?
Absolutely, a pleasure to be with you, and this is why I love GB News. A great topic, and I can't really imagine Sky News or BBC News covering this. The notion of the divine right of kings, it goes back a long, long way. It goes back to ancient Egypt. The Chinese had this notion of the mandate of heaven. But for Christian monarchies, we can best describe it as the concept that the monarchy claims sovereignty directly from God. The king is not subject to any earthly authority other than himself. And to challenge the king's authority and legitimacy is to go against the will of God. But similarly, just in the same way, it's the king's duty to follow God's laws and carry out God's justice. Now, this has roots in the Bible, in many, many places. There's scriptural justification. Daniel 2, God createth kings and removeth kings. And then in Romans 13, which I can just only paraphrase for you, essentially it says, all authority comes from God. The king is the ultimate authority on earth. And so if you rebel against the king's authority, you're rebelling against God's authority and will be damned. Now, as every school child knows in this country, well, as every school child should know in this country, in Britain, the divine right of kings is best associated with King James the First and Sixth and the Stuart dynasty. But after the overthrow of King James the Second and Seventh and the illegal usurpation of the throne by William and Mary, we had what the Whigs called the Glorious Revolution. And the divine right of kings was largely replaced by the contradictory and confusing concept we have today of the sovereignty of Parliament, which in my view is a deeply flawed concept. Yes. Because sovereignty surely rests in the sovereign. The clue is in the name, not in Parliament. But at any rate, the core principle of the divine right of kings still survives today. And if you have a coin of the realm in your pocket, just pull that coin out and look at it, and you'll see two initials there, DG for Deo Gratia, by the grace of God, and then Reg for Regina for the Queen, although new coins will say Rex, by the grace of God, Queen or King. Now that was added to the formal styles of the king back in 1521, but today it carries on throughout all the Commonwealth realms, except for Papua New Guinea, that King Charles reigns by the grace of God. And it's the same thing in Europe, in Denmark and the Netherlands and elsewhere. So what does grace of God mean in terms of a Christian monarch? Well, it means that God endorses the king's reign. And the coronation is based on the inauguration ceremonies of the kings of Israel in the Old Testament. And it all comes down to the idea of covenant. The coronation is a covenant between God and the king, and between the king and his peoples. And so as the king rules by the grace of God, it's the king's duty to actually represent divine rule of God on earth over his peoples in the form of justice, order, and mercy. God is just and merciful, and the king must therefore also be just and merciful. And of course, we saw during the coronation, order, mercy, and justice played key roles in that coronation services. Right. And remember, of course, the monarchy is... Sorry, I've spoken too much. I'll go back to
you're right. God is justice, and the king is ordained by God. But we seem to be in a middle ground in the UK at the moment, in that we don't necessarily believe the king is accountable to God exclusively. We also think he's accountable to the people too. It doesn't really seem to work out, this constitutional monarchy. It's a bit between a democracy and an absolute monarchy. I'm not entirely sure it will work in the long term. But I want to get my dualist Emma Webb's take on the divine right of kings.
I could listen to Rafe talking about this for hours, all day. I think one thing to mention, I mean, there's not very much you could add to Rafe's brilliant summary of the historical all of the historical aspects of this. There is one thing I think that's worth bringing in, which is this idea that goes back all the way to perhaps the late Middle Ages. I'm sure a historian can correct me if I'm wrong, but say it's Fortescue, who has been mentioned on this show previously. This idea that as in contrast to the absolute monarchy of monarchs on the continent, like in France, this idea that it is perhaps distinctly British, that the monarch is also subject to the law. So there are some limitations on the monarch. So the idea of the anointing, as Rafe mentioned, has biblical precedent, of course, and I do believe that the monarch is anointed by God, as he was saying, Deo gratias. But I think there is an important distinction to be made between the continental style of absolute monarchy and the style of monarchy here in relation to the divine right of kings.
I think you're pretty much right, but I don't think it's only in England that happens. The Holy Roman Emperor was also subject to natural law and divine law as well. So there are restraints upon it. But thank you very much, Emma Webb, and thank you, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, as well, for that wonderful historical representation of the divine right of kings.